Welcome to the Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, where every death had a life and every life had a story. My name is Jennie Johnson.
Hello, and I'm Diane Hartshorn.
We have a really fun guest with us today.
Very excited.
And I'm super thrilled to be sharing the stories that she's going to be sharing with us today. But before we introduce her and we get to her, we have a couple of, we're going to call it listener mail things to share that came in within the last week that Diane and I were super excited about.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to point these out because this is what makes part of what makes doing this podcast so much fun is when we get this kind of information from other listeners. So our first email comes from Patty, and she wrote, "Hello, I just found and listened to your episode on Bessie Rivers, which if you haven't heard that episode, Bessie Rivers was a madam out of Durango, Colorado that we covered earlier this year. It was this year. I can't remember the episode number. I probably should have looked that up before we started. I was so glad to hear it because Bessie was my husband's great-great-grandmother. Arthur Ferguson settled in Lake County, California with his wife and daughter. When Frankie died, he went to Colorado and returned with some of her things, including a small safe with her name painted on it, and it is still in the family. We've read about her in the Good Time Girls of Colorado book and some other publications, but it was fun to watch your podcast." So thank you, Patty. And she also enjoyed the fact that we had a different picture to show of Bessie than the one that they have within their family. And I can't remember what picture we found, but it was whatever was available in whatever online archive I found that one in. So Patty, we are so glad that we could present Bessie and share that, but it's so fun to hear that that safe still exists and that her name is even on it.
And they value their family history enough to hang on to it. And I think that's really commendable.
So that was a lot of fun. And then our other one was actually an instant message that came to us. I believe it was over Facebook. And this one was a lot of fun. I had shared it with Diane shortly after we got it. And I apologize. I'm not looking at the camera because I am scrolling for my message. Here it is.
One
yes.
thing.
So this one is from Sarah, who happens to be a flight attendant. She says, "Hi, I was listening to today's podcast, which was our episode that was last week, and chuckled when you said people look at you weird when you say you hang out in cemeteries." And this is our chat with Lauren Rhodes last week. Mm-hmm. We were talking about how people look at us funny for doing that. "I'm a flight attendant, and depending on the city and how much time there I have, I'll go and check out nearby cemeteries. And my crewmates always look at me funny when I tell them that I did that on the layover." So thank you, Sarah, for doing it anyway and enjoying those cemeteries and digging up the information. And she actually shared with us a really interesting cemetery she had visited as something for a future podcast. So I've added that to our list of future episodes. So again, Sarah and Patty, thank you both for listening and also sharing your little bits of information with us. So now we'll get into today's episode with our guest. Today we have with us a fellow Association for Gravestone Studies member, there we go, or AGSer as we like to say in short. Her name is Lynette Webber, and Lynette and I actually met in person last summer at the AGS conference, and she had presented on a topic similar to what she's talking about today. And then while she was here and we were doing our cemetery tours in person, I was able to point out a whole bunch of graves that related to her topic. And she took all of that and has created an entire new presentation because she was able to make all kinds of connections.
That's so cool.
And I'm super excited to have Lynette Webber join us today. So welcome, Lynette.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennie and Diane. I am very excited, and I was also a little inspired by last week's episode that there are hundreds, maybe thousands of us out there we're not alone in our love of cemeteries and our desire to spend a lot of time there and bringing our kids there starting out young. So I really enjoyed that episode. I felt some camaraderie there too.
Oh, good. Yeah, I think it always helps when we have guests on who say, they've been in these cemeteries forever, or they've taken their children or whatever, or they've been in one since they were a kid. So I think it makes everybody else feel better who get the weird looks on a regular basis. So Lynette, tell us a little bit about yourself, before we have you introduce your topic, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started in all of your cemetery research and genealogy and connections that you make.
Well, like many of us, I have ties that go way back. When I was 12 years old, I was only allowed to ride my bike for a mile, and that wouldn't quite take me to town, but it would take me to a cemetery on the outskirts of town.
Nice.
And I noticed that they took all of last year's fake flowers and dumped them over the side of the hill for the end of the year cleanup. And so I found the pretty ones, and I would go and find the babies' graves.
Aww.
And I would put them right back in the cemetery, probably much to the annoyance of the caretakers. But it always felt like a safe and comfortable and quiet place for me to go. And as I grew up and I had grandparents who were very involved in genealogy, I got hooked myself. In fact, I once failed out of college because I was up all night on Ancestry.
Oh, no.
Well, there could be worse reasons to fail. So, well,
Hey, I flunked classes so I wouldn't have to get up and talk in front of people.
and now look what you do.
I know, exactly.
Yep, here it is.
So today, your topic, and I was reading over your notes and stuff, but your topic is really cool because the topic you presented on last year at the AGS conference happened to be about some Cornish mining communities where you're at. And then I was able to show you some Cornish graves that are here in Colorado. And you took all of those and you started making connections between the communities in your state and the communities in our state. And you have just exploded with some really cool stories that you found by going all in on these. So go ahead and tell us a little bit about who we're talking about today.
Okay, well, I have named the presentation Cousin Jennies, and it's not just in honor of Jennie here. But because the Cornish people were known in the 19th century as Cousin Jacks and Cousin Jennies. And the story is that, I have a cousin Jack. If you hire him, he can come and do the work. And I think there's another potential alternate explanation that it wasn't cousin, but instead cousin, because the Cornish were somewhat known, especially the men who worked underground, for an occasional vulgarity, but also for their beautiful church hymns. And the Cornish tin mines were starting to fade in their profitability a little bit in the 1850s, 40s through 60s, at the same time that copper mines began opening up in Michigan's Keweenaw Peninsula. So let me see if I can get my hand map. Other way. For you guys. So here's the Michigan's Keweenaw Peninsula is the upper peninsula of the two-hand map. And so it's surrounded by Lake Superior on three sides, arguably four if you count Portage Lake. We might be an island. And so this was a very remote part of the country when mining began here in the 1840s. And there was only really a few other mines in the country that were drawing mine workers specifically at the time. And they were like Mineral Point, Wisconsin, where they had lead mines in that region.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the coal mines in Pennsylvania and that area were already starting to develop. So this was before the 49ers gold rush in California. And it actually had what's believed to be a bigger economic impact because you need so many people to make money off a copper mine, whereas a single person can often make good money with a gold claim.
Right.
So families are coming from Cornwall, England, sometimes the man first and saving up to send back for the family, or they're planning to just be working out of town, off the continent for a few years. And they came to this area starting in the 1840s, really through the 1910s when mining started to slow down substantially here. And so a lot of the mining company community cemeteries that were left behind have become substantially overgrown. Mining companies weren't in the cemetery business.
Right.
They weren't in the church business either. They didn't necessarily pay somebody to keep really good records of these burial places. And so oftentimes it's been a question for many generations as to like whose responsibility is it to take care of the lands of these defunct mining companies. And so some of them are in pretty rough shape, but you can see these connections in the remaining headstones. So for me, the moment that did it for me was I picked some random person who has the most elaborate monument in one of these small cemeteries here. And I started reaching off to the side and finding distant relatives and connections. And it wasn't too long before I ended up finding out that one of the Williams families of Central City, Colorado, was directly connected to the family that I started with here. And that not only were they directly connected, but that I had happened to take photos of their graves while you had me in the Bald Mountain Cemetery. And I was able to add those to find a grave. And then I realized once I researched them a little further that I even had taken images of their houses and their businesses in downtown Central City. And to realize that a woman had been substantially responsible for it really made me think about what are these other Cornish women's lives like. We know the men were miners, they went into trade, they did this, that, and the other thing. They had show horses and hunting dogs. But what were the women's lives like? And so I was able to find some really common threads, some really, really dramatic stories. When I told a friend about them, he said, "Wow, that sounds like it should be like the movie Centennial." I'm like, "Did you just say Centennial? You're not going to believe this." But actually, that movie was filmed in Central City and the surroundings. So I feel like we've got some really dramatic stories, some really human stories, and some connections that share the humanity between us all, tucked into the lives of a few of these Cornish women whose families crossed nations and the country, seeking out their American dream.
Well, what excites me about this, so for our listeners who've listened all the way back to the beginning, we started with the Central City Cemeteries,
Yes.
and we specifically started with a Cornish couple who had come over. He came over first, and she eventually joined him after a couple of years of him being here and trying to make money here. Now, this story, of course, here, we didn't start getting the miners here until about 1859 and 1860, so a little bit later than what they had out in Michigan. But that's when the gold was discovered here. So this is even more exciting to me because the whole reason this podcast got started was the research I had been doing up there on those cemeteries and the lives of these Cornish women, because it's always been the women, personally for me, when I started exploring those cemeteries, those were the graves that I was attracted to the most, were several of the women, and trying to imagine what their lives were like coming over from another country and then traveling across this country to get to Colorado and then going up into these high elevations and having to kind of learn how to live all over again and do stuff all over. I mean, they had to kind of learn how to cook differently and all kinds of stuff because life was so very different.
And there was nothing here. I mean, we were like on the very edge of the frontier. We had, the gold rush in 49 and ours in 59, but there really wasn't much until.
Right.
Yeah.
So I always wanted to know more. And so this is what excites me about today's presentation that you're doing, because you really were able to find some of those stories. And I also love the fact that they connected Michigan and Colorado together.
So I was going to ask you, Lynette, and maybe I missed it, because you said where you're at, where I'm at. Where exactly are you besides Michigan?
I am located on the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, surrounded by Lake Superior. And I'm in what's called the Copper Country of Michigan. There are several copper countries throughout the country, but we also have 3 substantial iron mining districts surrounding us. And so that's meant that it's been a substantial destination for anyone who is interested in a mining job for a number of years, the 1850s through, as I said, about the 1920s, but it really was very Cornish and Irish and German in the beginning, as there were established mines there and a lot of people with experience. And as time passed and technologies changed and requirements for the work changed, people came from all over to take the jobs.
Yeah, I know those Cornish were especially sought after for a while because of their experience in those tin mines back in Cornwall. So again, for those of you who are just listening, if you get the opportunity later on to go back and check us out on YouTube, Lynette has pulled up an entire presentation that it's going to include some photos, some maps, and a bunch of other things so that you have a more visual idea of her story as she goes through the lives of these women. So definitely take time to go back and look at us on YouTube when you have that free moment.
Well, thanks, Jenny. I've got my screen up here and it's entitled Cousin Jennies, Cornish Women of Mining Country Cemeteries. Gilpin County, Colorado and Keweenaw County, Michigan being the focuses. And I have the picture from the entrance boulder to Bald Mountain Cemetery here because this is the site where I was able to explore some of your home stomping grounds. And I could see very easily why you were so inspired to start a podcast like this one. You've got something really special up there in the mountains. And in looking at the Cornish names there, in the stones there, I saw tons of Cornish names like Gelbert and Trudgeon, Truhalla, Triglone, Rowe. These are all among the most common and well-recognized Cornish names, but a lot of Cornish people had names like Williams and Richards. And so they weren't all as easily recognizable. Grenfell, Glanville, Grandville, lots of G's and T's mixed up in the Cornish names. And the reason I kept this part of this program in is because I wanted to point out this beautiful stone that you've actually talked about, I think, in a past podcast with the cherub face for Matilda and Matilda, children of the Thomas family. And both of these children belong to the same couple, and they were named the same name one after one was lost, they renamed another child that same name. And because I came across this trend at least 5 times in our story, I thought it was worth sharing this beautiful stone again as a reminder of that tendency.
That's one of my favorite stones up there.
It is absolutely gorgeous.
It's beautiful.
And so you could see I was looking for women's names when I was at Bald Mountain Cemetery. But sometimes you would find names that were really unclear. Is this a woman? Is this a man? This is just initials. So who are the Bartles? Who is JP and who is EH Bartle? Well, I looked a little bit deeper into that and I found that EH Bartle is indeed a woman. Her name was originally Elizabeth Jane Holman when she was born in Camborne, Cornwall, England. And I probably shouldn't say Cornwall, England. That's what I'll Find a Grave puts it into, but it's really part of Great Britain. Cornish people do not generally consider themselves English as a whole or as a rule. Camborne is actually the sister city to the place where I live. And so I felt an immediate kinship with Elizabeth. And she was married in her early 20s in Cornwall before the family moved to the Mineral Point, Wisconsin region, to those lead mines that I had been talking about earlier. They started to have their children, their family expand when they were in Wisconsin. And so by 1850, it was John, Elizabeth, their daughter Catherine, son Francis, and son William. The next year, their daughter Elizabeth was born in Mineral Point, Wisconsin. At about the same time, John takes off to California for a couple of years because we're not very far after the start of the gold rush there.
Right.
And while he's away, their son William passes away in Mineral Point, Wisconsin. Now, there aren't any markers for this family there. I'm not sure if there ever were any or not. The cemeteries from this time period are very sparse in markers in that section of Wisconsin. So John P. comes home and then he goes back to California for a year and he comes back again and they all move to Copper Falls, Michigan with their new son, also named William, after the older brother who had been lost. I was going to try to move my window out of the way here. Okay. And now I can describe this photo of a young Elizabeth Holman Bartle. She is wearing what appears to be dark and fairly plain clothing, but perhaps with velvet trim near her elbows. And it buttons down from a white collar with a brooch to a waist which seems to feature some sort of buckle. It is otherwise a very simple dress. And this next picture, she's standing up and seems to have paid a little bit more for this portrait session. She's with a very fancy chair, and she's got a slightly more modern dress on.
Yeah, the hoop skirt is gone in favor of a different sort of petticoat in the back, but it's not really a hoop.
Probably just post-Civil War is my guess for this one, and that the other one was prior to or during the Civil War era.
Yeah, I can't tell if from the style of this one if she might have a bustle behind it. It's because she's facing forward. There's a good chance there might be a slight bustle in the back of that one.
Right, but there's definitely no major sleeves yet, so we're not to the 1880s. And they spent the Civil War here in my part of Michigan. By 1860, John and Elizabeth were in Houghton Township of Keweenaw County. And they had children, Francis, Elizabeth, William, and they had a boarder named William Johns, a miner living in their household. It seems like they were living and working at the Central Mine and at the Cliff Mine at different times. So these are two mines that had communities built up around them pretty exclusively for the workers who were involved there. And while they lived there, son James was born, and then son Henry Oscar was born and died at the Copper Falls mine. When I started looking into this family, I found out about son Henry, and I was like, gosh, this name sounds familiar. Why do I know this? And so I went to find a grave, and I searched for all the Henrys in Keweenaw County cemeteries because I had already looked for Bartle, and it wasn't getting me there. It was a typo, and I actually managed the monument. I had inherited it from another fallen graver.
That's why you recognized it.
I was able to fix it and connect it with his family's monuments on Find a Grave immediately. And so this is the first of those things like, wow, it feels like I was meant to be looking into this one. So while the family is still living in Copper Falls in Keweenaw County, Michigan at the copper mines, John leaves after the Civil War to go to Nevadaville, Colorado. Now, after the Civil War, a lot of the initiative to be mining here in the Upper Peninsula was substantially reduced. Copper prices had fallen, and a lot of the smaller mines were closing. That meant that the only jobs that were left were in the bigger mines, and they tended to be deeper and more dangerous already by this point. And so a lot of the time, this westward movement was also for shallower, less dangerous mining opportunities. So Henry Oscar Bartle is buried at Pine Grove Cemetery in Eagle Harbor. I have a picture of his monument here. It is a small square marble monument that has a broken rose, very similar to some that we saw at the Bald Mountain Cemetery.
Mm-hmm.
So her family left some really fascinating stories on their public ancestry. And I thought a couple of these excerpts really make Elizabeth seem so human, so much a person that you could encounter in your day-to-day life and have so much personality. So a couple of these quotations from the family were that she made rag rugs and Ruth and Edna had to cut rags for her. These were among her grandchildren. She used to sit by the hour and recite poetry, but they never knew if she made it up, had memorized it, or what it was.
I love it.
And I love the photographs. There's so many photographs of her through the years. And this one that we're looking at is one from Central City. Swanson's photography opposite the Teller House, which I'm sure is a big thing in Central City, right, Jen?
Yep, the Teller House is still there.
And she's got some bling on in this picture.
She does. That necklace or
brooch,
and it looks like below you can't really see it, but I'm guessing
like
she's
chain coming out.
Yeah, there's a chain, so it's either maybe some kind of a watch or a chatelaine, maybe even.
Yeah, because you can see it comes out to the top, and you can see it underneath the dress, like halfway. You could just see the outline of the chain by the third button.
I
and then
hadn't
it
even
comes out.
thought of a chatelaine. I had thought maybe a watch, but the family did end up being landowners and renting out some properties in Nevadaville. So there is a chance that it could be as her role as a landlord.
I just love her eyes in this picture because the other pictures are taken from a little further. Well, the first one's more blurry. The
Right.
second one, she's standing further back, but this one, you really get a sense of her eyes. And like, you can tell she definitely had a sense of humor.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm sure she worked hard through a lot of things and, you know, was the tough mom when she needed to be, that kind of thing. But there's also definitely a sense of humor playing in her eyes. And even in the little
Right.
bit of smile she has going on in this photo. I love it.
She probably
It's
was that
almost a
grandma.
smirk.
She probably was that grandma that would tell tales, like they said. They didn't know she made them up or not.
Mhm.
Oh my gosh, she's so darling.
And that was one of the things that really struck me about this family too, is that there are so many branches of it, and I was able to find pictures of women
Yes.
from most of them. So the families themselves are interested in their history
That's
Which we love.
fantastic.
and sharing it, which is always absolutely amazing and makes it so much more meaningful. So she fell and broke her hip in Nevadaville
Oh,
in
no.
by 1899, which is when her husband died. The grandkids couldn't remember exactly when it had happened, but they knew that she was somewhat handicapped
Mm.
by the time her husband passed away. And they weren't always too kind to this old woman who had a hard time getting around. Another quote from a paper written sometime around 1915 is that she was short and dumpy, never too clean, and loved her liquor. So she's, I don't know, very, very human and very natural to me. I don't see her as somebody up on a pedestal, but instead somebody that you could really meet and know and talk to and talk about these kids today.
Well, and as
There's
somebody, if she broke her hip and had to get around on two crutches for
Uh-huh.
the rest of her life in Nevadaville, by the way, which for those folks who've never been up there, it's a mountain. It's steep. You're going up hills all the time. I mean, you might go downhill for a second, but mostly you're going uphill to get outside. So, like, I'd say it's okay if she loved her liquor at that point in her life.
But her
Right, that's kind
dress.
of what I was thinking. They're not being too kind here. Like, what
Yeah.
other options did she have? I'm sure medical care, as we will see later on, wasn't ideal
Mhm.
in many cases.
But
And then
her-
she moved to Central City to live with her daughter Libby after a while, and that wasn't much less for the hills.
No,
so her dress is so elaborate. The decoration on it is just
there's a lot of beadwork
there's a
on this
lot,
dress.
and she's still wearing that chain.
Yeah, it looks like it's the same one too, doesn't it? I'm going to flip back just for the picture. Yes, that's definitely the same
Oh, yeah.
piece of jewelry. So it must have been a very meaningful piece of jewelry for her. I'm sad that we can't see the end, but by the way she's holding it, I'm really thinking watch chain here.
Mm-hmm. I'm
Oh, I
kind of
wonder if the
thinking you're right.
family, I wonder if the family might still have it. Wouldn't that be something?
That would be amazing. They actually have kept her daughter's silver service and a few
Oh,
other
cool.
pieces. So I wouldn't put it past them. So back at the Bald Mountain Cemetery, where we learned about Elizabeth Bartle, we have this beautiful plot surrounded by a very strong fence that's highly intact, and it has a monument in it that looks kind of like a woodsman's monument, but I don't think it really is. It's a tall tree trunk made of sandstone, and it's elaborately carved in memory of Richard Williams.
It is really tall.
April. Yeah, it almost looks like another tree. If I was projecting this on the wall, I'd feel like I had to go and touch it so that you could be sure which one of these trees is actually the headstone. And then in the foreground here, you can see Williams on a very light marble monument, and then there's Oscar Williams in the center, and more family members off to the side of this really large fenced plot.
Yes.
So we're going to look at how these families connect with another fabulous picture. This is
Look at her gown.
Elizabeth's daughter, also named Elizabeth, who went by Libby. And her gown has like burnt velvet surrounding what looks like satin ruffles.
Mm-hmm.
And is she wearing her mother's necklace? I can't rule it
if
out.
it's not that one, it's very similar to the one her mother's wearing.
So this is about what, 1880s, would you think, for this picture?
Yeah, because her sleeves are just starting to look a little puffed. We're not puffed yet,
I
but there's
she
a
has
little
a-
puff on those sleeves.
And she has
maybe
a
70s. I think she's in Central City probably by this
Mhm.
point.
uh-huh. And she has a bust on her table. So do you think that's like, Queen Victoria always had a bust of Albert after he died, so there was always that bust in all the pictures.
Mm.
Do
I
you
haven't
think
identified this bust yet, but that's a really intriguing question. And it looks like, is she holding a piece of paper or is that a letter opener that looks like a butcher's knife in her hand?
That's what I was wondering
what
too.
I was
I was like,
thinking.
it kind of looks like a knife from the angle, but I'm thinking it's probably more of a letter or a piece of paper, but it does kind of look like a knife.
Yes, it does.
Don't
So
mess
I
with
think
Libby,
that
guys.
she was probably with, unless I can identify the bust. I mean, if you have a bust and a piece of paper or a book in your portrait at this point in time, you're, I think, suggesting a studious nature.
Okay,
Is
she looks
often
like
the
it. I mean, she
intent
has
here.
kind of a very serious. I mean, they all look serious, but like she's very contemplative in this picture. The
And
look
she
on
has
her face.
rings. She's got a ring, I think, on every finger except for her pinky.
Maybe even there, but
Wow.
yeah. And I love her hair. She has bangs.
Mhm.
Right? They're very curly bangs.
Yes, they are, but they're just not typically what you see with the straight, slicked, pulled back hair of the time. And
Mm-mm.
she's, I think, very attractive in
Mm-hmm.
this
Oh,
portrait.
it's a gorgeous photo.
And so this is Libby, who was born when the family was in the Mineral Point, Wisconsin area. So Dodgeville, Iowa County, Wisconsin, where there were lead mines. And when she was a little girl, they moved to Keweenaw County, Michigan. And I recently learned that even though it seems like, oh, you're just going from Wisconsin to Upper Michigan, you would probably, take a road. If it was Southeast Wisconsin, you were more likely to travel to Chicago, get on a boat, travel through Lake Michigan,
Oh,
across the Straits of Mackinac, slightly into Lake Huron, and then into Lake Superior by the Sioux Locks. And so it was almost like crossing an ocean.
yeah, that would be
in
quite the
many ways.
voyage, especially depending on the time of year too.
Yeah, it would have been quite an experience. And so when she was 16 years old and the family had moved from one small town mine to another small town mine for a while, she married a fellow Cornish person named John Benny. And they had their first child together here in the Keweenaw the next year. Daughter Anne did not survive. And that's about the time that the family moved to join father John P. Bartle in Nevadaville, Colorado. About the same time they get there, November of 1869, her new husband, John Benny, dies of typhoid fever, which I'm sure was not super uncommon in the mining camps.
Nope, it happened a lot.
And that same month, she had another child,
Oh, wow.
John Benny Jr.
Talk
Oh,
about
so he died in November and she gave birth in November.
Also in November. And
she
so
just lost their first child only literal months before that, like within a year before that. So, jeez.
Yep. But she does have her mom and her dad and her siblings. So it's very fortunate that the family had all
Yes.
moved together. And in 1870, I believe this is a portrait of Elizabeth taken during her mourning.
I was gonna say she looks sad even before you said that.
In
Oh.
1870, she lived with her parents, brother Francis, William, James, all of the brothers. James was born in Keweenaw County. Her son John, aged 6 months at the census date, and there were a few boarders, and one of them is going to be particularly relevant, a miner named Richard Williams, who had also moved to Colorado from the Keweenaw. So they had
likely
probably
they knew
known
each other.
before that. And in December of 1870, so just a little more than a year after the loss of John Benny, Libby married Richard Broad Williams. So if we want to take a moment to look further at this photo, she looks, like you said and agreed, really sad.
Yeah. Her eyes
there's-
look extremely tired.
a beautiful brooch, but aside from that, there seems to be no adornment that would be inappropriate for mourning from the
There's
time.
just a small amount of lace at the collar, and that's it.
And it looks black. I mean, it's black and white, and a lot of clothes look black and white, but I really feel pretty convinced by the shading of this.
How old was she when she got married?
She was 16 when she got married the first time.
Okay, that's what I thought. She was really young. Okay.
And she's 19 now, getting married for the second time. So here is Libby with Richard Broad Williams, her second husband.
She looks a little happier in this picture.
She does. And I love how she's standing and he is seated, because it seems a reversal of the poses that you frequently see from men and their wives. I don't know if it means anything in particular, but I found it to be, maybe he was really tall. And if
I was going to say they're trying to even out the height a little. Yeah.
Further away.
I like this because then you really kind of see the shape of her gown and how the skirt of the dress falls just above. It's not quite touching the ground. It's just slightly above. And it's not black. It's for sure not black. It's definitely a lighter color, possibly white.
She has ringlets. Her hair's in ringlets, which is usually the style of a younger.
Yes, it's frequently a sign of a maiden. But we also noticed in that last really sad looking photo that her hair was substantially down.
Yeah, like half up and half down.
I wonder if they're just not, she was still under 20 years of age, even if she was a widow. So I suppose in a place like Nevadaville, there might have been a little bit of flexibility in how you mourned.
Yeah, because this would have been, how long after her husband did they get married? Her first husband?
A year and a month.
Oh, right after the mourning period, which is a year and a month. Oh, wow.
So in 1871 or thereabouts, I was never able to find a precise record of Colorado having what it has available. Her son, John Benny III, dies, so she's lost 2 of her children. And then in 1872, the couple is still living in Nevadaville, and they have a daughter who they name Lillian. In 1873, they have a son named Richard Oscar, who will go by Oscar for most of his life. And in 1875, they have a daughter, Mabel. In 1877, they have a son, Clifton John, and their eldest daughter, Lillian, passes away.
My gosh, she had a baby every year, almost every year.
And she's lost half of them. So far. She's now 26. In 1879, they have another daughter, and they name her Lillian. And then a few months later, both Clifton John and the second Lillian, they pass away within 24 hours of one another.
That makes it sound like one of the epidemics that was going on.
It does. But we can learn a little bit more about their deaths. There were something resembling death notices printed in the Central City newspapers. But more importantly, the family saved a letter that was written by Richard to his parents. And so from Bald Mountain on July 25th of 1879, he addressed his parents, "My dear father and mother, I again drop you a few lines with an aching heart and assure you we have lost our 2 little darlings, Clifton John and little Lillian. They died, Lillian on the 22nd and Clifton on the 23rd. They were buried in the 24th in one little grave, and with them all our future happiness. Libby is almost heartbroken. Clifton was almost 2 years old and Lillian 4 months and 5 days. Clifton was very sick, about 4 hours. The doctors could not tell what he died with. It was very near like our first Lillian. Died with all in the throat, and the baby was about a week. They died just 23 hours apart. The baby was not very healthy, but the boy Clifton was the handsomest boy that anyone ever saw. He went over to Kate's just a little while before he died, but he's gone now forever. It seems as though we cannot raise our children, God alone knows what for, but it is so hard, and hard to believe that there is a just God. We were getting along so well, we had everything this world would afford. I shall take Libby to the valley as soon as she can get away. And so we often talk about how common it was and how, of course, these parents felt these losses in ways that it's hard to comprehend because it's so painful.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not often that we're able to see such a personal reflection of a parent's anguish at these losses.
Especially from a dad, from a man. I mean,
Right.
it's just so heartbreaking.
And I know I missed a couple of words, but it's hard to read it because it is very emotional, and I was getting kind of a little bit teary-eyed.
That's okay.
But I felt it was absolutely worth sharing with you because for me, one of the things about cemeteries is when you stand at the grave of an infant, it's almost like you're looking at the potential for alternate histories.
Mm.
What could have been, what would have been, and that's something that you can share in common with those parents who would have been standing there asking that same question. It's a very emotional connection for me since I was 12 years old and putting flowers on babies' graves in the cemetery.
Well, and if anybody decides to watch this on YouTube, you'll be able to read the entire letter because Lynette has a beautiful slide, a photograph of the letter that would be on our YouTube.
And it's typed rather than handwritten, so it does make it easier to read.
It does, but there are all of the original spellings intact.
Oh, yeah.
Which that's another level, but also a little bit of an understanding of what kind of accent or dialectics would have been used.
I'm glad whoever, transcribed it, they didn't take it upon themselves to correct the spelling. So that was really good that it was transcribed that way.
So the family has faced a lot of loss, but they're continuing to move forward. And in 1880, Richard Broad Williams is elected sheriff of Gilpin County, and they move the family to Central City, where they get a house on Eureka. In 1885, they have another son who does not survive beyond that year. And in 1888, they have George Arthur. In 1890, more than 20 years after the birth of Libby's first child, daughter Edna is born, followed by daughter Ruth in 1894. Now, in April of 1896, Richard Williams was voted out of the sheriff position, and he had not legally been sheriff for, I believe, about a week and a half. But they're still living and working in the neighborhood, and he hears a shot coming from upstairs at the marshal's office at the courthouse, or the former courthouse. And so there are a lot of newspaper ads, pieces, and accountings of what happened that day. I selected a pretty short one for this slide to read, and it is that April 15th, 1896, the marshal of Central City was shot in an upstairs office, and Mr. Williams, hearing the shot, was hastening to his assistance when the murderer coming from the stairway met and shot him. He was at once taken to his home and everything possible done for him, but to no avail, and he died 4 days later. In the meantime, his murderer, while trying to escape, was shot down with a Winchester. Mr. Williams was in the prime of life when cut down, being only 49 years old. He was buried in Bald Mountain Cemetery, and his was the largest funeral ever held in the county.
And his story is one that I've heard told several times by different historians up there, but that's a well-remembered story about his life and death.
Yes, he's a pretty well-known figure in Central City for a number of reasons. I think high up there are not only the beautiful gravesite, but also the livery stable bearing his name to this day. So this is the house on Eureka where the family lived in 1896. Seems to be a pretty simple one-story house backing up against the hills on kind of the center of Central City. And it looks so much like it did when he lived there. It's actually quite remarkable, the preservation of this house.
I just was thinking the kids running around with all the hills and the rocks behind them.
Oh,
Just
they had a good time of it. And
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
stories of lots of mine shafts and adits and things back in there too. Some of them connected to the houses. So it's fascinating. We have some of those stories here as well. After Richard's death, we are actually able to learn a lot about Libby. After Richard's death, Libby, she continues all of the things that he was active in the community. He wasn't just sheriff, he was a speculator in mining companies. He had racehorses and he had hunting hounds, and he was an active pugilist for part of his youth. So she didn't continue the pugilism. She had let that part go. But Cornish wrestling was a pretty big thing during Richard's youth. So this actually ties back to that first picture of Libby, I think, where she's holding a piece of paper theoretically, and she's looking at a bust on a table near her. That in this biography of the leading people of the area, she is noted as Mrs. Williams, was educated in the public schools of Wisconsin and Michigan, where her girlhood was spent. If she had anything to say about this, that was up to her, that her education was listed foremost. And I love that for her. She was married after coming to the state in 1870 on the 25th of December to R.B. Williams. Since the death of her husband, she has continued the livery business on Eureka Street and also looks after the mining interests left by him. She has stocks in the Little Annie and another mine in the Buckeye District, also the mine on Thompson's Ranch, and has proved herself a shrewd woman of business. She is the mother of 5 children: Oscar, who has charge of the livery barn, Mabel, George, Edna, and Ruth. She is a zealous worker in the Episcopal Church and in the Guild, and is a strong Republican politically, a member of the Women's Relief Corps, and Pocahontas Lodge, of which she is keeper of wampum. And that is a reference to the Order of Red Men's Auxiliary Group.
Mm-hmm. Which there is an Order of Red Men cemetery up there in Central City.
Yeah, that's the part of that Gilpin County cluster.
Yep. So I like this picture of her because you can see the younger version of her still in this picture, even though she's definitely years older. But you can still see the curliness in her hair that she had as a young woman, but definitely the grace and
she's got a poise,
wisdom that came with all the heartache and stuff that she'd lived through.
And she looks like her mom. I mean, she looks like her mom, and she's definitely somebody you could just see. It's like, don't mess with me. She was a force to be reckoned with if she needed to.
Absolutely was. And she also seems to have been really generous in her community. So here's a little bit more distant and more casual photo of her. She looks like she's got a real sense of humor in this picture. It seems like her lips are curled up into a grin, and she is outside in front of a wall of what seems to be some kind of vine next to a stairwell. I can't really tell for sure if those are some kind of grape, but definitely some kind of vine there.
It's hard to tell.
So I've clipped a few of the many newspaper articles, most of which are about social happenings that mention Libby. And I thought these would be interesting to those who knew Central City better than I do. So in 1900, Edward W. Williams of Denver has sold to Mrs. Libby Williams of this city, of Central City, the 2-story brick building west of the old county courthouse. Now, my understanding had been from the history that I saw in Central City that building was already the Williams stable by that time. But if it was, I mean, this seems a pretty direct reference.
West of the courthouse, and I'm trying to picture it in my head because the courthouse, by 1900, I think had been relocated because that was after the Great Fire.
Right.
So it might actually be on the other side of where the main street is, if I'm thinking of this correctly.
Well, I saw the old county courthouse, and I knew that the one brick livery that remains is a 2-story brick building west of an old county courthouse, but there certainly could be more of them. And it shows her interest in real estate, and she was actively transacting businesses, not just managing what was left to her, which would have been, I'm sure, plenty of work as it was, as they were substantial landholders. And so after a while, she sold the house on Eureka to a guy named Peter McFarlane, and she had purchased or had built another house for herself. So here's a view of Central City looking down into the town. As I first approached it, Jenny was driving.
The big old van that I was navigating through the mountains there.
Yeah, and you let me sit in the front seat, or I stole it.
Yep.
So I had the perfect view coming into town here.
Oh, how cool.
This is coming into town from the direction of Black Hawk, because we actually came up through Black Hawk up into Central City to get to this. So that's for any of our listeners who are familiar with that route, that's the view we're looking at right now.
Yeah, and you can see one of the rock piles. Do you call them tailings piles there? We call them poor rock piles here.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so your tailings piles are kind of a yellow golden color, where ours tend to be somewhere between gray and dark red.
Sort of a rusty.
So it's a very different look, but a very similar feel to what I am used to.
Yeah, and the tailings are all over up there. Like you can, as you're driving around up there, there's tailings piles everywhere. You can tell where the different mines were at by the tailings.
Oh, that's cool.
So when Libby built herself a new house, it was this one that's on the left of this photo.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so she was right next to the courthouse where her husband was shot years before, but also only a couple of buildings away from the Williams livery.
Yep, which is just down the street there.
Primary owner.
Is that the brick building? This is on the other side of the courthouse?
It's further. Yeah, it's a yep.
It looks like a livery.
This building.
Yep, there it is. It still says Williams Stables on it.
Yeah, I understand that it belongs to a friends group of the theater who use it for storage and a number of other things, and that they have maintained what would otherwise be quite ghosted signs if they still existed at all. And so it's incredible to me that you can look at it and it looks so much like it did in a picture from 1900. Well, and then Williams Stables, livery and feed stables, and all advertisements on it.
Well, the thing is, you can definitely, this illustrates the steepness of the town, because it's like, it's not sideways, but it looks sideways. So it just goes to show, oh my God, what it must have been like.
Well, and you can see between it and the building next to it, you can see the stairs that are built up to the next level, because it's all built on levels. So there's another street behind it, but you actually have to go upstairs to get to the next street, and then the same thing behind that. So there's all these stairs in Central City to get to the next level. And Nevadaville was built the same way, although there's not as much left building wise in Nevadaville as there is in Central City. So
it's like sidewalk staircases.
It really is.
That's here in some of our valleys. Yeah.
That's how you got from one part of town to the next. They were very good shape, I think, climbing those hills. That's why, when you're talking about our first woman, Libby's mother, walking around on crutches, imagine this is what to get around town, this is what she was getting around town in on 2 sets of crutches.
Well, hopefully her grandson at the stable could have come and picked her up instead of
giving her a little lift.
Her a hard time.
I certainly hope so.
So I found a few more of these newspaper clippings demonstrating Libby's prowess as a businesswoman, as well as her generosity to the community and her ownership of numerous buildings in the community as well. In 1907, there's a baseball team forming in Central City, and she offers a vacant room on Lawrence Street across from Jenkins, McKay and Company that as a changing room for the boys on the baseball team. And so she, has plenty of space available to do this kind of thing to help out and show her support. And by this time, she probably had a grandchild on the team as well. She was involved in all of the required legal claims that you needed to have to create mining companies. and to make
Mhm.
improvements upon these claims and to make sure that everyone in a partnership is pulling their fair share of the weight on numerous occasions. There were notices of forfeiture and similar things filed by Libby Williams to maintain her interests in those mining companies that her husband had left her in part, including a Nevada pool of practical miners working on the silver plate mine at the old Reed Thompson Ranch in the Eureka mining district. So she was one of the owners of a Nevada mine as well.
You know what I find super fascinating about those is they have her listed as Libby Williams or Mrs. Libby Williams rather than by her husband's name,
Mm-hmm.
as so often would have been the case even then.
Well, and I think you'll see that it is more common after she was widowed to be Mrs. Libby Williams rather than Mrs. Richard Williams.
Right.
That's part of the way it was used as an indicator of whether you were somebody's relict.
And what's so
Which is
cool
always
about
such
this?
a term.
And what's so cool about this? This is in 1909. Colorado women had the right to vote, but the nation did not have the right to vote.
Mm-hmm.
And and a lot of women couldn't own property. And here she has ownership in mining claims, which
In addition to other property.
yeah, very smart. Because I think she lost two husbands and she was going to make sure she was taken care of.
Yes,
Herself.
not for herself alone either, as Elizabeth Cady Stanton would say. She made sure that all of her children had solid occupations or businesses to run.
Yeah.
Wow.
So Elizabeth Libby Williams died in April of 1949 on the exact same day as her second husband, Richard Williams, had.
Oh.
But 50...
I was trying to do the math.
Yeah.
More than 50 years later. Yeah. She long outlived both husbands.
Yes, she did. But then she died on the same day. And so you have to be standing outside the family plot to see where the monument was modified for the addition of her name to be engraved on it.
Okay, so this is the stone that we saw in one of the first photographs of the big, tall tree.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh,
But this time we're
cool.
just looking at Elizabeth J. Williams with her information, aged 97 years, right next to the fence line. The fence is right up.
You can
next
see
to
that.
it.
This is one of my favorite details of this is the ivy that's carved all the way up and around the base of the tree or the trunk of the tree. The ivy is just so detailed.
It is. And then there's the spot where it looks as though a branch has died and fallen off, and it has fallen in such a way like the bark is still kind of there, and there's just a hole where the heartwood has fallen. And these details are just really, really
and
incredible.
It's been because sometimes the sandstone ones don't hold up as well because it's a softer stone, but it's fairly well protected in the cemetery. Where even though it's a mountain cemetery, this cemetery doesn't have as much of the aspen and stuff that some of the other cemeteries do. It does have a lot of evergreen trees, but I think it's just more protected from the elements, even in the winter and stuff. So that's why a lot of these monuments in this particular cemetery, I think, have held up as well as they have.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen one like this.
And then there's some of it has to do with just the way the sandstone was carved and how good of a piece of sandstone it was to begin with.
Yeah.
Too.
Wow, that's amazing.
And it's an incredible marker, and it really does blend in with the other trees because it is so statuesque.
Yeah, if you're not looking at it just right, you don't realize it's a marker and not just one of the other trees.
Right, because in this picture where we saw it in the beginning, it looks almost the same. So now that we've heard the story of the day when the 24 hours when they lost two of the children that they lost, I will show you that there's this behind one of these birch trees in the aspen in the foreground. There is a white marble marker that we can see a couple of rose leaves on. It's really hiding behind this tree here, but that is the marker for Lillian and Clifton, those two children who died on that one day in 1879.
So she had, by the time the one article came up, they'd listed 5 children that were still living, but she'd had how many altogether then? between her first and second marriage?
I haven't sat and counted them all, but I want to say at least 10.
Yeah, it seems like it because there were a lot of children and she lost so many. I mean, she lost nearly half of the babies that she ever had.
I think she lost 4 from her second marriage, maybe 5, and then the 2 from her first.
And then the
marriage.
first 2 from her first marriage. Yeah. Poor thing.
Well, and so often how women died in childbirth or from complications thereof, that she had that many children and close together for the most part, except maybe for the one that was born 20 years after the first one. But it just goes to show what a strong woman she was. It's incredible.
In so many ways. She persevered.
Oh, definitely.
She created an incredible foundation for her family. And it seems like they're still very proud of her to be able to find that many photos of the women in this family. I think really speaks to that they know what a treasure they have that they descend from.
Well, if it wasn't for her, they may not be here.
I'll have to remind my kids of that on a regular basis.
Yes, good point. I think I need to too.
We are going to stop here for today. Listeners, if you have been listening on any of the audio apps, please make sure you go and check out the YouTube channel so that you can actually see all the photographs and other documents and things that Lynette has provided so far for this conversation. We were having so much fun, and Lynette had so much more to share that we've had to actually split this episode into 2 episodes. We've done this many times before, so make sure you join us next week for the rest of Lynette's stories about these families and their connections between Michigan and Colorado and how she was able to put them all together. If you go on our social media pages, so both Facebook, Instagram, and possibly Twitter, now X, we do also have a family tree that she has created that will help you to make a more visual connection of each of these women that she's talked about, as well as the husbands, the brothers, the uncles, the fathers, all of that. So it's all on this family tree, and you'll have a chance to check that out. It's on our website as well. We thank you again for listening, and we will see you next week for the rest of our conversation with Lynette. Thank you so much.
So we thank you for taking the time to join us for this ordinary, extraordinary story. To learn more about the story we shared, please visit our website, theordinaryextraordinarycemetery.com, where you will find the resources we used to research this episode. And if you are watching us on YouTube, make sure to click the like button, the like thumbs up, and to subscribe and leave us a comment, because this all helps move us up in the YouTube algorithm. And also, if you care to donate or buy us a coffee, we have a link on our YouTube description, or if you visit our website, the little coffee cup is located at the bottom left-hand corner.
And please don't forget to visit us on social media, where we share all kinds of cemetery photos, quotes, tidbits, and more. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, and on X, formerly Twitter, at OrdExtraSim. If you enjoyed this or any of our episodes, please consider leaving a 5-star review and a comment on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or our website. Your positive reviews and enthusiasm for our show help others who love cemeteries and history to discover us and our ordinary, extraordinary stories.
Until we meet again.